Si tout le monde veut bien s'installer, on va commencer, si vous voulez bien. Donc cette audition sera en français et en anglais. Et normalement, c'est sur le canal 2. C'est ça? Oui, vous pouvez le dire en
Good morning. The presentations will be in French and English. And you can find the translation French-English on channel 2.
C'est ça? Non, 3. Deux pour l'anglais et 3 pour le français. 2 for English and 3 for French. Mais comme je suis française et que mon anglais n'est pas très bon par ailleurs, je préfère m'exprimer en français. Et je pense d'ailleurs que c'est assez bien pour les publics francophones, puisque cette audition va être enregistrée, que nous puissions apporter une meilleure connaissance de la Corne de l'Afrique aux publics francophones qui ont une ignorance assez importante de ces sujets. Et c'est un de mes chevaux de bataille. Donc je voudrais tout d'abord vous remercier, vous tous et toutes qui êtes là un lundi matin pour une audition qui a été préparée un peu rapidement et dont certains d'entre vous viennent d'ailleurs d'assez loin. Je vais tout particulièrement remercier nos intervenants, bien évidemment. Excuser Binan Simon qui va nous rejoindre mais qui a loupé son train, donc qui va être un peu en retard. Au besoin, nous basculerons dans le panel, le second panel. Et je voudrais remercier aussi les membres du Parlement européen, ceux qui m'accompagnent ce matin, ma collègue italienne Barbara Spinelli et ma collègue espagnole qui va nous rejoindre, Lydia Senra. Je voudrais aussi excuser les parlementaires qui nous ont apporté le soutien, contrairement à ce que montre l'affiche, mes collègues Elena Valenciano, Anna Gomez, Bodil Valero, Maria Gabriel qui va peut-être passer dans la matinée, Ivo Weigel, Charles Goerens et Judith Sargentini. Et puis je voudrais aussi tout particulièrement remercier, bien évidemment, Europe External Policy Advisor, sans qui cette audition n'aurait pu avoir lieu. Donc un grand merci à leur concours. Je pense que pour ceux qui sont là, il n'est nul besoin de souligner l'importance que peut avoir cette réunion à quelques jours, quelques heures même, du sommet de la Valette, où on discutera des relations entre l'Union européenne et l'Afrique, et notamment avec un point sur la question de la Corne de l'Afrique. Ce sommet va avancer sur la mise en œuvre du plan d'action régional pour la Corne de l'Afrique, qui fait suite, donc mis en place à l'automne dernier, qui fait suite au cadre stratégique pour la Corne de l'Afrique qui a été adopté en novembre 2011. Selon les termes mêmes de ce cadre stratégique et ce plan d'action, il s'agit d'un instrument pour encourager la paix, la stabilité, le développement durable et la prospérité. Les pays concernés sont Djibouti, le Kenya, l'Ouganda, les deux Soudans, si vous me permettez cette expression, la Somalie, l'Éthiopie et l'Érythrée. Et il s'axe autour de 3 axes, stabilité et sécurité régionale, migration et développement, lutte contre la radicalisation et l'extrémisme violent. Il est censé permettre aux pays d'aider les pays concernés, excusez-moi, je me suis levée un peu tôt, d'aider les pays concernés à atteindre les objectifs du développement, les objectifs pour le millénaire du développement. Il se fait en coopération entre l'Union européenne, la Communauté de l'Afrique de l'Est et le Conseil de coopération du Golfe. Au départ, il a quand même beaucoup été inspiré, justifié par la nécessité pour l'Union européenne de lutter contre le terrorisme et les foyers de l'islamisme radical. Mais je dirais qu'il a changé de nature et de priorité avec la mise en place du processus de Khartoum à l'automne dernier, sous présidence italienne, qui a permis de rallier au dispositif l'Égypte et la Tunisie, afin de centrer encore plus ce processus, je dirais même de le prioriser, sur la question des migrations. Pour le ministre de l'Intérieur italien, c'est la plus grande réussite de la présidence italienne au deuxième semestre de l'année dernière. Pour Madame Mogherini, elle aussi italienne, autre représentante de l'UE, c'est un modus operandi novateur qui devra inspirer le Conseil de l'Union européenne. Je précise qu'on est en matière d'affaires étrangères, donc c'est le Conseil qui a la prééminence d'intervention en la matière, et l'on peut dire que le Parlement européen a un rôle plutôt marginal en la matière, même si nous tentons d'influencer les décisions. Alors on parle notamment, dans le cadre de ce processus de Khartoum, de l'avantage réciproque d'une gestion équilibrée des migrations, de migrations bien gérées et de nécessité de répondre aux causes profondes des migrations. On veut faire une campagne sur les dangers des migrations pour les personnes concernées. On veut lutter contre le trafic, aider à la surveillance des frontières, notamment par des programmes de formation vis-à-vis des forces de sécurité sur place. On oublie sans doute qu'il y a seulement, dirais-je, 22 000 demandeurs d'asile qui sont arrivés depuis la Corne de l'Afrique en 2014, alors qu'il y a 700 000 réfugiés des mêmes pays en Éthiopie et 550 000 réfugiés au Kenya. Et je trouve, quand on lit les documents qui sont sur la table aujourd'hui, que l'on confond de plus en plus migration économique et réfugiés. Est-ce une confusion volontaire ou due à la diversité des pays concernés? Je pose la question, je ne me permettrai pas d'y répondre au début de cette audition. Je dirais que ces objectifs peuvent se comprendre avec certains des pays concernés. Mais on ne peut avoir la même stratégie, mettre dans un paquet global des pays dont la situation est particulièrement différente, et notamment un pays comme le Soudan qui continue à bombarder sa population civile, ou un pays comme l'Érythrée, où sévit depuis 2001 une des pires dictatures du monde. J'assume tout à fait les mots. Quel type de négociations veut-on mener avec ce type de régime? Dans quels intérêts? Quel type de stabilité, alors qu'il contribue justement à l'instabilité de cette région en étant, y compris, les principales causes des mouvements de population? Quelle gestion des migrations entend-on promouvoir? Quelle lutte contre le trafic et les trafiquants, alors que ceux-ci ne peuvent exister a minima qu'avec la complicité, sinon des gouvernements et encore, du moins des autorités qui sont censées contrôler ces trafics? Quels seront les bénéficiaires des aides versées, et notamment celles de l'aide au développement? Les chiffres qui circulent pour l'ensemble du programme sur la Corne de l'Afrique, c'est 3 milliards d'euros. Ce n'est pas négligeable et on est en train de mettre en place un fonds fiduciaire, c'est-à-dire un fonds qui permet d'accélérer le financement de l'Union européenne à hauteur de 1,3 milliard. Dans les chiffres qui circulent, mais j'avoue qu'à ma grande surprise, encore que, l'Érythrée, notamment, apparaît et disparaît des programmes de l'Union européenne. Le chiffre le plus souvent cité est un chiffre de 250 millions d'euros qui retrouve les chiffres des années 2000-2005, avant que l'aide de l'Union européenne soit interrompue vis-à-vis de ce pays. Et je précise que ce n'est pas principalement du fait de l'Union européenne, mais plutôt principalement du fait de l'Érythrée, qui a refusé les programmes de l'Union européenne. Visiblement, le gouvernement érythréen a changé de position et est prêt maintenant à bénéficier de cette aide. Mais pourquoi faire? Comment imaginer que la population des pays concernés, notamment au Soudan, mais plus encore en Érythrée, arrivera à toucher le moindre centime de ces aides? C'est donc à toutes ces questions que j'espère nous allons en tout ou partie répondre, en tout cas que vos interventions, celles de nos intervenants, permettront de nous aider pour essayer de travailler plus correctement vis-à-vis de ces pays-là qui ont effectivement besoin de stabilité et d'aide aux populations, mais je ne suis pas sûre que la voie qui est empruntée actuellement nous y mène. Et je vais passer la présidence à ma collègue et amie Barbara Spinelli, puisque je reviendrai pour les conclusions.
Merci Marie-Christine et à bientôt. Et de toute façon, mon intervention, c'est pour vous remercier toutes les ONG, les dissidents, les opposants qui sont venus ici nombreux. Je suis vraiment très heureuse. Je remercie d'autant plus Marie-Christine pour avoir organisé cette audition et pour son engagement constant et à côté de ceux qui se battent pour la démocratie en Érythrée et dans les pays du Corne d'Afrique contre la logique du procès de Khartoum. Et les guerres, les persécutions, les violations des droits des hommes, les calamités naturelles et les crimes ambientaux, comment on dit, du climat, ont obligé 2 millions à peu près de citoyens du Corne d'Afrique à laisser ses propres maisons. Et dans ces premiers 15 années des années 2000, et ceux qui ne sont pas devenus des réfugiés de l'intérieur ont cherché d'arriver en Europe en faisant face au désert, aux bandes criminelles, aux camps en Libye, à la traversée souvent mortelle dans la Méditerranée. Toutes ces personnes trouveront dorénavant des soi-disant hotspots que la Commission et le Conseil européen ont voulu, ont décidé. Dans ces hotspots, on décidera à quelle catégorie les réfugiés appartiennent. On fera un triage. Si ce sont des réfugiés qui peuvent présenter la demande de protection internationale, si ce sont des migrants économiques à rapatrier. Je rappelle que la majorité des responsables européens s'obstinent à parler des questions migrants, qu'on s'éclaire désormais qu'il y a une question réfugiés et que la frontière entre migrants économiques et réfugiés devient de plus en plus subtile. Cette distorsion du langage migrants, réfugiés, ça a un but précis. Sa fonction, c'est de la part de l'Union européenne, c'est de se débarrasser de ses propres responsabilités, de créer la Forteresse Europe. Nous savons très bien que la plus grande partie des arrivées en Europe sont réfugiés et de la frontière de la différence entre migrants et réfugiés, j'ai déjà parlé. Et quand j'entends Madame Mogherini parler des programmes novateurs, j'ai presque des frissons, parce que tout cela, l'Europe l'a connu très bien. mais y compris la distorsion du langage. On ne disait pas le mot déportation, mais transfert, et on triait les personnes, on faisait des sélections, on abandonnait les enfants à leur propre destin. Tout l'Europe a déjà donné, il n'y a rien de novateur en cela. Il suffit d'étudier un peu les années 30. Chaque année, nous nous souvenons du naufrage de Lampedusa. Il y a eu 360 morts érythréens, 8 morts somaliens. Si je ne me trompe pas, c'était le 3 octobre 2013. Je me souviens Don Moussi quand nous les avons invités en plein air le 29 avril dernier, Marie-Christine et moi, et qui disait la meilleure façon d'honorer la mémoire des morts, c'est celle de sauver les vivants. Et c'était à propos de l'institution d'une journée européenne de la mémoire des réfugiés morts en mer. Mais comment l'Union européenne sauve les vivants? Il me paraît qu'il le fait jusqu'à maintenant en réduisant le secours en mer, qui est confié à Frontex et à EUNAVFOR-Med, qui ne font pas justement le secours et le sauvetage en mer. On le fait en créant le procès de Khartoum, qui en échange de beaucoup d'argent donne la gestion de la migration de l'Afrique et du Moyen-Orient aux pires dictatures, celle d'Afewerki en Érythrée, celle d'Al-Bashir en Soudan. En juillet, quand la Commission des États-Unis, présidée par l'avocat Mike Smith, avait présenté au Conseil pour les droits humains un rapport sur l'Érythrée, l'Union européenne avait prospecté, comme disait Marie-Christine, 300 millions d'euros d'aide aux 300 millions d'aide au développement en faveur de ce pays, de l'Érythrée. Un vrai cadeau au régime d'Afewerki. L'objectif, disait Bruxelles, je cite, c'était d'arrêter la fuite des milliers de migrants de ce pays. C'est dit clair et net. Rien de novateur, de nouveau ici. Tout à fait inécouté, non écouté à Bruxelles comme à Rome, les protestations de la diaspora et l'appel lancé par de nombreux enseignants et professeurs universitaires, hommes de culture, journalistes, ex-diplomates, activistes, qui ont dénoncé ce type d'aide et tous les procès de Khartoum. La Commission ONU est en train d'évaluer la possibilité de porter Afewerki devant la Cour pénale internationale pour crimes contre l'humanité. Mais cette même Érythrée, dont on parle pour la Cour pénale internationale et pour crimes contre l'humanité, a été invitée à la Valette, et le ministre des Affaires étrangères de Afewerki et sera là avec d'autres leaders africains. Je sais qu'une délégation de la diaspora érythréenne sera à Malte. C'est très important. Elle sera là, je le dis clairement, elle parlera aussi en notre nom, au nom de l'organisateur de cette conférence. Parce que nous voulons continuer à vous représenter et à vous aider. Merci. Et je donne... Ah, je suis chair.
Oui, mais je vais reprendre la présidence 30 secondes parce qu'on a fait un peu de modifications et pour d'une part pallier au retard, je dirais, de Binyam Simon, mais aussi peut-être pour recadrer les choses un petit peu autrement, compte tenu de la façon dont on a démarré, en donnant tout de suite la parole à Martine Plot, qui est journaliste spécialiste de la Corne de l'Afrique et qui connaît bien les questions migratoires, m'a-t-on dit.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether I should stand or just sit. I sit. Okay, thank you. Good morning. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I will keep my remarks fairly brief. What I would like to do in this presentation is to go through really three major points very quickly. The first is which states in the Horn of Africa are driving migration. The second is what marks out the Eritrean government. What is the evidence of Eritrea's response to European Union initiatives to date, and what lessons can we learn from this issue? If we look at the first one of these, which states are driving migration, the first point that we have to make is that clearly all the major players in the Horn of Africa are dictatorships of one form or another. We only have to look at the repression in Ethiopia, for example, where they held elections in which the government won every single seat, to see that this is not a happy state of affairs. Much the same can be said of Sudan, where, as has been pointed out, the president is wanted by the International Criminal Court. Having said this, there's something seriously peculiar, in the true sense of the word, about Eritrea, which is, if you look at the statistics which have been produced by Frontex, the overwhelming majority of the people who are fleeing from the Horn of Africa by far are Eritreans. If we take the comparison between Eritrea and Sudan, for example, you have, of every 100,000 Eritreans, 340 sought sanctuary in the European Union in the second quarter of 2015. By comparison, for every 100,000 Sudanese, just 8.9 took the same route. So there's a complete disparity in the number of people who are arriving on Europe's borders. The vast majority are Eritrean. The Eritrean situation is therefore not just bad, it is uniquely bad. And that has to be taken into account in any consideration of how to take up this question. What marks out the Eritrean government? This question must be really seen in this way, which is that Eritrea is not effectively a functioning state. It is effectively an organisation run by a single individual and the group of people around him. This is President Isaias Afwerki. There are no published accounts of Eritrea. Even those which were promised to the UN monitors, and I've produced a paper which shows this, 2 years ago, have not been provided. There are no published accounts. Therefore, there is absolutely no way in knowing in which way any funds that are provided to Eritrea will be used or not used or misused. There's also one organisation, the PFDJ. Any relationship with Eritrea is exclusively and only with the PFDJ and its subsidiary or front organisations. There are no independent organisations. This poses enormous problems for any relationship between the European Union, which is used to dealing with legitimate organised states and civil society, and the situation that pertains in Eritrea, where none of these conditions apply. Relating, therefore, to Eritrea is exceptionally difficult. The third point that I wanted to very briefly make is the evidence of the European Union's relationship with Eritrea so far. One shouldn't forget that the European Union was very supportive of Eritrea and the Eritrean people during their time of crisis, during the terrible war that they fought against for 30 years against the Ethiopians for their independence. Also in 84-85, huge support for Eritrea. So it's not as if that the European Union comes and the European institutions and individual nations come from nowhere. They come from a very good position. They were supportive of the Eritrean people in their time of need. The response, however, from President Isaias and his government has been one of utter contempt. When the major repression took place in 2001, of which I'm sure many of you are familiar, when really essentially there was a clampdown on all forms of opposition, even within the PFDJ or the old EPLF, with the rounding up of the G15, the European Union protested. The Italian ambassador was expelled for his protest, and all the European Union ambassadors left. They waited to see what would happen. They demanded that the conditions of the return should be a willingness of President Isaias to engage in human rights dialogue. Guess who gave in? It wasn't President Isaias. They came back in a piecemeal fashion, and frankly there was never any dialogue and never any acceptance by President Isaias. If we then move forward, we will see that in 2007 there was a similar attempt to have a new beginning with Eritrea, which was led by the Development Commissioner Louis Michel. He held talks with the Eritreans. He opened relations. There was a dialogue. It went well. It seemed to go well. He even arrived in 2009 to think that it was possible for him to go to Eritrea with a ticket for Dawit Isaak, who has been in jail for many, many years, because he was going to have freedom for him. And when he gets to have talks with President Isaias, guess what? Nothing. No response, no freedom. He humiliatingly had to go back on the plane without Dawit. This is the reality of the relationship between the European Union and the Eritreans. It is one of many promises and complete lack of fulfillment by the Eritrean government. And quite frankly, I think we have to now accept that the Eritrean government is not effectively a suitable candidate to have a relationship with. This is a government whose own activities are now being investigated by the UN Commission of Inquiry for crimes up to and including crimes against humanity. There is no higher category of crime that could be committed by the Eritrean government. The findings on their 500 pages that have already been made public by the Commission are absolutely damning. They have been supported by every major UN human rights organisation. I will not belabor the point, but this is not a suitable government to have a relationship with. What, therefore, are the lessons that we can learn from this sad history? The first, I would argue, is that there is no evidence whatsoever that President Isaias and his government has any intention of moving away from its present policies, which involve the systematic denial of human rights. As the EU representatives acknowledged privately in 2009, attempts to build a relationship with the regime are unsuccessful and will fail. The second point is that repeated attempts to win the regime over have always failed. Past promises of reform made by Eritrean diplomats carry no weight. The political prisoners remain in detention, democratic rights are denied, and there is no freedom of conscience or religious expression. Rather, as the EU's experience of 2001 and 2009 indicates, any softening of pressure is regarded by President Isaias as a sign of weakness. The regime believes it can outlast any external criticism. Thirdly, promises of aid and international assistance have not resulted in any softening of this stance. Attempts to establish a new engagement with Eritrea without seeing concrete and verifiable changes in policy and practices of the regime will require abandoning the human rights agenda that is an integral part of the European development policy. Fourthly, the European Union's initiative termed the Khartoum process aims to identify sources of economic support in order to stem migration. Treating the problem as economic misses the point in relation to Eritrea. As Baroness Kinnock has said herself, the regime in Eritrea is, in short, a secretive, reclusive, authoritarian tyranny which is ruthlessly controlled by President Afwerki. The root cause of Eritrean refugee crisis is the absence of the rule of law and the repression of its citizens. And unless these underlying causes are addressed, nothing else will work. Fifthly, from the above it is clear that the Eritrean government cannot be regarded as a suitable partner for the European Union. Its repression is worse than almost any other in Africa, and I speak as somebody who was for many years the African editor of the BBC World Service. I have seen the repression at close hand, and this is not a government that should be dealt with by anyone who considers themselves a democrat. There is every likelihood that the aid will be diverted, directly or indirectly, into the Eritrean military, thereby further destabilising the Horn of Africa. This was a point that was made in great detail in the latest report by the UN monitors who presented their findings to the UN Security Council, which reimposed sanctions against Eritrea and which made it clear that Eritrea was a country which was a risk to the entire region. If the European Union provides aid, they are effectively stoking the fires of discontent and the fires of war inside the Horn of Africa, and that is a very serious charge. Given the lack of transparency of Eritrean finances, the European Union will not be in a position to prevent this diversion from taking place. I am particularly concerned by the leaked document which is due to be presented at Valette by the European Union. This is it's only a draft document, the Valette Summit Action Plan. Item 4 concerns the prevention of and fight against irregular migration, migrant smuggling and trafficking in human beings. It envisages a relationship between key EU organisations and the Eritrean state. It is a deeply, deeply worrying idea. The concept that it is possible to, for example, support the law and order enforcement, judiciary and border management authorities of a state like Eritrea should never appear in a European Union document. This is outrageous. We would not do this in apartheid South Africa. Why are we doing it with Eritrea, which has a worse human rights record than apartheid South Africa ever did, and I fought against apartheid for more than 20 years. Sixthly, let me say that all proposals for cooperation between the EU and international security forces and their Eritrean partners must be resisted. This is the point I've just made. To assist the Eritrean regime in its stated goal, this is a stated goal, of halting the flight of its citizens under the guise of curtailing the activities of people smugglers and traffickers would be unconscionable. Finally, in the light of the above, and given the European Union's commitment to human rights as an integral part of the development process, I would suggest that Eritrea cannot be regarded as a suitable or legitimate partner in the forthcoming African Union-EU summit in Valette. I would suggest that the invitation to the Eritrean government should be withdrawn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Plot. It was really a very interesting intervention you made, and it will guide us in, I think, in this discussion. We forgot at the beginning of this meeting to give a big thank to the presence of the European Commission, to Mr. Hans Stausboll, who is here, responsible for development and coordination for East Africa, who will take the floor later. Now I would like to give the word to Mr. O'Farrell or Mrs. Pardon, of Safe World Brussels. She will speak about the Khartoum process, cooperation framework, human security in Sudan at risk.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No worries. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chloe Chico-Farrell. I am the EU Policy and Advocacy Officer for Safer World. We are a conflict prevention and peace-building organisation. We work in over 20 countries in the world, including in the Horn of Africa, and most specifically Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, and Uganda. So I'm based in Brussels, and over the past few months, I have come to realise that migration has become the EU's main concern and priority. So, as you know, the EU and its member states have come under increased pressure to deal with the internal as well as the external dimensions of this unprecedented flow of migrants and refugees arriving in Europe. The problem is that as part of the EU strategy, they are actually, as Mr. Paul just made the case, are prioritising engaging with repressive regimes that are actually at the root cause of a lot of these movements and should actually be held accountable. So in my presentation today, I'm going to make the argument against this approach, and instead I'm going to make the case for prioritising effective conflict prevention and peace-building policies using Sudan as a specific case. First, however, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of recent policies and frameworks that have been adopted with regard to the Horn of Africa, as have already been mentioned today, but more specifically how they relate to the EU's relationship with Sudan. So as you know, most people arriving today in Europe are fleeing deadly conflicts in the Middle East, but the EU also recognises that a lot of them are coming from Africa and of relevance today from the Horn of Africa. Therefore, just a couple of weeks ago, the EU adopted a new action plan to frame its engagement with the Horn of Africa countries, and specifically to frame engagement around migration and border management. So in the framework of the action plan, the EU specifically, so among a number of initiatives that are going to be established, has specifically determined to step up implementation of the Khartoum process, which is also known as the EU Horn of Africa Migration Route Initiative. So, as Ms. Vergiat mentioned, the Khartoum process was launched last year in November 2014 at the behest of Italy and the Commission's Directorate for Home Affairs and Migration. And it brings together member states of the EU, countries from the Horn of Africa, and Egypt and Tunisia, which are important transit countries. The aim of the EU in the framework of the Khartoum process is threefold. First of all, it aims to support the capacity of its partners by providing training and capacity building in border management and more generally in migration management. Second, it aims to address irregular migration by enhancing cooperation on returns and readmission. And thirdly, it aims to support efforts to prevent and combat trafficking in human beings and smuggling of migrants. So just a quick note, the Khartoum process has two strands. So the first strand is political engagement, and the second plan is actually to start implementing specific projects. Implementation has yet to begin, and there has been so far no information whatsoever made available publicly as to what exactly this might look like. The action plan for the Horn and the Khartoum process are going to be implemented through the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Stability and Addressing the Root Causes of Irregular Migration in Africa, which is going to be presented at the Valette Summit this week. The Emergency Trust Fund is a delivery mechanism to pool funds from loads of different donors, but also is designed to deliver immediate and concrete results to address migration. So the EU's approach to the Horn of Africa, as has been set out in the action plan, in the Khartoum process and in the Emergency Trust Fund, is of concern for a number of reasons, which I will now lay out. So the first problem is that in spite a reference on paper to the need to address root causes of migration and forced displacement, the main objective of the EU is clearly to achieve quick wins to stem the flow of migrants trying to reach Europe. In the ministerial agreement, which launched the Khartoum process, there is not one mention of root causes, of factors that are actually pushing people to leave, or of the factors that are enabling smuggling and traffickers to actually thrive in the region. Therefore, the process is merely designed to address the symptoms of this problem, symptoms which include porous borders, for example, or just the mere existence of traffickers in the region. Second aspect, which has been touched upon today, is that the EU is actually prioritising partnerships with repressive regimes that are responsible for important refugee outflows. So Sudan is an interesting case in point. The UN Refugee Agency noted that in 2014, Sudan was the fourth largest country of origin, with an estimate of over 666,000 refugees. In addition, there are 3.1 million IDPs in Sudan today. Therefore, by trying or by promoting further engagement with Sudan, the EU is actually overlooking the role played by human rights violations, by bombardment campaigns, by corruption, by poor governance, in actually driving people or pushing people to leave, whether they are from the region most affected by the national conflict in Sudan or from the other areas in the country. It is also overlooking the crackdown on civil society organisations and on the media, which have a very important role to play in holding the government to account and in monitoring its actions. This approach also fails to recognise the role that some of these countries are actually playing in human trafficking and smuggling. A 2014 report by Human Rights Watch identified that in Sudan, traffickers had kidnapped, abused and tortured refugees, the majority of which are Eritrean, to extort money from them or from their families. But the report also found that Sudanese police and military officers had also been responsible and had been colluding with traffickers, either by turning them to traffickers, by turning a blind eye at checkpoints, or actually by returning people who had fled back to the traffickers. Finally, the report from Human Rights Watch found that Sudanese authorities failed to identify and prosecute a majority of these traffickers and officials. This in turn raises many interesting questions around the absence of rule of law in Sudan and the EU's aims in collaborating with the country. A third area of concern is that although traditionally the EU has been very cautious when engaging with Sudan, which is under EU sanctions, re-engagement now actually risks conferring legitimacy to the regime and actually plays into the hands of its current foreign relations strategy, which aims to present itself as an island of stability within an ocean of instability, to quote Ibrahim Gamdour. So the regime, as I mentioned, is feeling very much emboldened and is actually selling its allegiances for the moment to the highest bidder, irrespective of whether this is in the interest of its population. Therefore, by promoting engagement with Sudan, the EU may reinforce the regime and actually may increase its resilience to international pressure to find a solution to the conflict and to actually sustainably address the root causes of conflict and instability in Sudan. Although the EU sees this current migration crisis as an opportunity to engage with Sudan on an issue of mutual concern, to then open the door to engaging on other issues, the question should actually be to what extent their respective interests actually do overlap, and whether the EU should be sacrificing its commitment to the people of Sudan and to peace in Sudan in favour of an opportunistic engagement which may have little or no impact at all on movement of people, but also may have very negative impacts on the people that are having to leave or flee their homes in Sudan and in the broader area. To achieve quick wins to disrupt migratory flows from the Horn to Europe, there is a clear risk that the EU is going to deprioritise its own peace building and conflict prevention policies in the area. However, without addressing the root causes of migration, and most specifically without addressing the root causes of conflict and instability, which are driving migratory flows and reinforcing smuggling networks, the EU's engagement in the Horn and specifically in Sudan are not going to yield positive results and are not going to yield sustainable results. The fact that domestic concerns are actually driving the EU's response and the EU's approach to the region may actually lengthen the crisis and create the conditions for further conflict. Therefore, the EU absolutely needs to recognise that there is no quick fix to migration, but also that supposed quick wins are not going to produce results that are in the interest of the people in Sudan or in the interest of the EU itself. Ahead of the Valette summit, the EU should bear in mind two things, amongst many other things. The first is that they should be committing through their diplomatic engagement to first and foremost support inclusive and long-term solutions to the conflicts and instabilities that are affecting the region and actually pushing people to leave. In addition, the EU needs to interrogate the motivations and the incentives of its partners in migration management initiatives, but also reflect on how its own policies and strategies and actions in the area are actually contributing to the situation. Ahead of the high-level summit this week, and ahead of the next meeting of the Khartoum process, which is scheduled to take place before the end of the year, the EU and Member States need to ensure that their commitments to peace and human security are not brushed under the red carpet, but that they are placed front and centre in their immediate and long-term response to the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. It's clearly a feminine name. I should have understood that before. And I would like to give now the word to Mrs. Selam Kidan, a human rights campaigner. I think she has many important things to tell about her experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to put across my perspectives and the perspectives of millions of Eritreans as the EU makes pertinent policy decisions regarding our situation. Many Eritrean citizens are leaving their country, taking enormous risks along the way to a longed-for place of safety. The process is a part of a larger movement of people towards Europe from many countries across the Middle East and Africa, but the Eritrean situation has its own distinctive characters. Eritreans are people fleeing a situation. They are asylum seekers owed protection under the Refugee Convention. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, and other sources track the rise of the numbers of Eritrean refugees from 6,400 Eritreans who applied for asylum in Europe in 2012 to 14,580 in 2013 and to 44,600 in 2014. At present, around 5,000 Eritreans are fleeing their country each month, making our small country a top producer of refugees. Eritreans are second only to Syrians as the largest group of those entering Europe to seek protection. Among them are unaccompanied minors, vulnerable women and children arriving by boat after surviving dangerous journeys through the Sahara Desert and then across the Mediterranean. The sheer magnitude of the numbers leaving Eritrea and the risks that people are taking in order to do so are at last beginning to receive some attention. Yet, as long as the situation continues, a basic question continues to be raised. Why are so many Eritreans abandoning their homeland, and what are the consequences for them and for their homeland? Many explanations focus on the way that the conditions of life in Eritrea, a once genuine beacon of hope, have plummeted. Eritrea's human rights violations and the political repression under the long-term rule of Isaias Afwerki have been reported extensively by many agencies, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and most comprehensively the findings of the UN Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights in Eritrea, published in June 2015. Eritrean analysts have also provided detailed evidence to identify the reason for the exodus. There is a pervasive insecurity in Eritrea. The UN Commission declares, and I quote, "Faced with seemingly hopeless situation, Eritreans feel powerless to change. Hundreds of thousands of Eritreans are fleeing their country. In desperation, they resort to deadly escape routes through the desert and neighbouring war-torn countries and across dangerous seas in search of safety. They risk capture, torture and death at the hands of ruthless human traffickers." End of quote. Many are vulnerable young people who have experienced abusive and indefinite national service or are anxious to avoid the imminent forced conscription. At the same time, when Eritreans manage to find some security, typically in Western Europe, their troubles are not over. European governments often respond by attempting to downplay both the scale of human rights violations in the country and the socio-economic decline. Such manoeuvres are designed to ultimately limit those that are granted refugee statuses and thus mitigate what European policymakers often see as the economic incentives or pull factors that are drawing poor people from across the world. The push and pull model of migration is one of the oldest formulations amongst those studying the phenomenon. This sees migration as inseparable from development and puts economics at the heart of the process. The model has been extensively applied to Eritreans and generated a lot of work on the connection of political and socio-economic deterioration that has led many Eritreans to flee. The government's failure to adopt viable economic policies, forced conscription and constant militarization are seen as being amongst the push factors in this situation. But like any model, it can be limited, neglecting the individual and collective turmoil affecting decisions about migration and any rational process for weighing its costs and benefits, or the ability of the individual to cope with this. The risk that Eritreans are taking to leave their country cannot be explained by a mere list of factors pushing and pulling them. We need to understand the implications of the level of political violence perpetrated against them on the individual, on the family and community level, and ultimately at a societal level. Understanding these aspects is relevant to understanding the mass migration of Eritreans currently occurring. For instance, the push and pull model might imply that scarcity and impoverishment should impede long-distance migration, as people wouldn't be able to afford the cost and danger of such travel. Yet, Eritreans are spending thousands of dollars on getting themselves smuggled out of their country and tens of thousands if they are caught up in the trafficking in human trafficking, such as the situation we saw in the Sinai Peninsula. A decision to leave and the willingness to make sacrifices in order to do so indicates the degree of threat being faced in Eritrea on both an individual and a collective level. Political violence, as such, from resulting in physical injuries or death, constitutes a traumatic threat that imposes great harm on a person's mental health. But the consequences can also be a form of collective or cultural trauma which undermines further the social bonds and that violence has already damaged, impeding in the individual's and whole community's ability for a coherent decision-making or problem-solving. The sheer number of people caught up in Eritrea's refugee crisis, the risk they are taking to flee their country, and the difficulties of loss and separation they are living with all add to the psychological complexity of what is happening. In this respect, understanding the Eritrean experience needs to become more holistic and go beyond the iteration of push and pull factors for migration. Such an analysis becomes even more crucial as the European Union tries to stall the departure of Eritreans and their arrival in Europe. A mere hope for a positive change in Eritrea which would allow European countries to justify return to Eritrea is not a basis for sound policy. And the delivery of substantial aid package to a regime that has shown no commitment to reduce the political violence perpetrated against its own people is unjust. Previous attempts to engage Eritrea using similar approaches has failed to register any progress with respect to human rights. The current EU approach is motivated by short-term considerations, and the net effect will only further empower a regime that has no intention of curbing political violence. It will not help us Eritreans, and it will not stop the desperation that is leading people to flee their homeland, and it most certainly will not result in a just Eritrea. What is needed is an approach that sees our problems in the round and puts our experiences at the centre, guided by a commitment to help us heal and rebuild our country. It is only when Europe and the international community enlarge policy development considerations in this way that that a way through Eritrea's crisis could be open. I therefore, this morning, invite anyone interested in policy development pertaining Eritrea to walk a mile in the place of the thousands of young Eritreans who feel their only option is to flee as far as their poor, tired feet would take them. Or the young mothers who risk their lives and the lives of their young or even unborn children for a chance to raise a family with some security before decisions are made that could hasten the desperation and push them towards taking even more risks to flee Eritrea.
Thank you very much, Salam, for this moving description. Now we will have an intervention by Baroness Glenys Kinnock of the House of Lords. It's through video, but as the sound is not perfect, I will ask Professor Miriam Verrijzen perhaps to read the text which Baroness Kinnock will pronounce. I don't know what to do now.
There's first going to be a trial to see if the sound is working.
Okay.
Relentless cruelty, tyranny and oppression are tragically everyday experiences for Eritreans. It's horrifying. It is also so far away from what so many Eritreans heroically fought for and what campaigners outside that country were supporting in the struggle they made. For liberation.
If you can put on your headphones, even if it's in English.
1988, I travelled to Eritrea with a War on Want team. I think we have a wonderful opportunity to prepare for the Valette conference and to focus on particular issues, particularly issues relating to the problems and suffering which many Eritreans continue to endure. Human rights violations, relentless cruelty, tyranny and oppression are tragically everyday experiences for Eritreans. It's horrifying. It is also so far away from what so many Eritreans heroically fought for and what campaigners outside that country were supporting in the struggle they made for liberation. 27 years ago, in March 1988, I travelled to Eritrea with a War on Want team, which many of you will be aware of War on Want, to look at water projects and to assess other ways of developing partnership and support with Eritreans. I've also been there twice since in delegations from the European Parliament, when I, of course, was an MEP myself. In 1988, in the midst of conflict, incessant Ethiopian air attacks meant that we could only travel at night, and the devastating effect of the 27-year war between Eritrea and Ethiopia were painfully plain. At the hospital in Orota, on the night after the Battle of Alphabet, we saw men and women fighters of the EPLF army with the most terrible, terrible battlefield injuries. And we also witnessed the bravery, the skill and the inventiveness of the people of Eritrea. This and other experiences at that time made me even more determined to continue to show practical solidarity with the Eritreans who were demonstrating the indomitable spirit which had for years enabled them to fight poverty, famine and armed Ethiopian aggression. When I returned to Britain, I wrote a book in which I expressed great admiration for the people, for organisations like the National Union of Eritrean Women and for the EPLF leader, Isaias Afwerki. When Eritrea finally won independence and the victorious forces rode into Asmara in 1993, We rejoiced at what we and countless Eritreans thought was the beginning of a future of freedom. We were so wrong. 20 years later, Eritrea is now being described as Africa's North Korea, and the cruelty which is inflicted on Eritrean people by the Avawaki regime certainly justifies that description. The National Assembly hasn't met since 2002. The 1997 Constitution has never been implemented. There is no independent judiciary. Extrajudicial executions, torture, arbitrary detention of journalists, teachers and members of religious groups are very, very common. Eritreans are not allowed to move, speak, assemble or organise freely. Indefinite compulsory military conscription and forced labour continues to prevail. The recent UN Commission report calls such conditions slavery and said, and I quote, "Some of the gross and widespread human rights abuses which are being committed in Eritrea under the authority of the government often constitute crimes against humanity." A member of that UN Commission of Inquiry said, "We seldom see human rights violations of the scope and scale as we see in Eritrea today." The list of atrocities goes on. Women face discrimination and sexual and gender-based violence and are being denied access to justice. Few, if any, detainees are brought to trial. Disappearances are commonplace. According to Human Rights Watch, prisoners are held in crowded underground cells or in shipping containers with no space even to lie down. The regime in Eritrea is, in short, a secretive, reclusive, authoritarian tyranny which is ruthlessly controlled by President Avawaki. His rule of terror, because that's what it is a complete betrayal of the cause of liberation and self-determination which so many Eritreans fought for and died for. That is why such large numbers of Eritreans are prepared to risk everything, including the shoot-to-kill system operated in border areas, to escape their country, to seek a better life for themselves and for their families. The scale of that exodus is huge. In 2014, almost as many men, women and children fled from Eritrea, a country incidentally of 6 million people which are not at war, as fled in that year from Syria, a country of 18 million people torn by 4 years of war. Clearly, a very large proportion of the people who cross land and sea in the desperate effort to reach Europe are, in fact, Eritreans. And they are unquestionably refugees under every definition of that pitiful status. All the evidence of the horror is in the UN Commission report and in the testimonies of the Eritreans. There is no need and no room for anyone to doubt these facts. What is needed now is decisive action and a clear and unequivocal policy on maintaining and fully enforcing UN sanctions against that Eritrean regime. The UN Commission urges us to offer protection to Eritrean asylum seekers, knowing that in Britain and the European Union we must surely uphold the principle of providing refuge to people who have a genuine and justified fear of persecution and are fleeing from what manifestly constitutes crimes against humanity. There can be no good reason to say that giving refuge will simply encourage more to take awful risks, something we've all heard. Living in Eritrea is in itself an awful, awful risk. Thinking about leaving is an awful risk. Doing it is an awful risk. It isn't the prospect of refuge that makes people flee. It is the dread of staying which makes them abandon their homeland. Eritrea is isolated politically, regionally and internationally, and UN sanctions are very firmly in place. We are hearing now, however, some suggestions that substantial financial aid should be given to Eritrea as part of efforts being made to stem the exodus of refugees. Such a course, if it was ever taken, would be disastrous, not least because on the basis of all the evidence about the regime, any EU aid offered to Eritrea would be seen as an endorsement of the government and used to entrench a repressive regime, not to help those in need. It would also certainly breach the EU's commitment, which states a very strong and important commitment. Human rights is at the forefront of EU development cooperation. We need clarity on that and other concerns which have been raised, and I very much hope that in your discussions all of these issues will be discussed and raised. Nothing can obscure the fact that Eritreans, they're being terrorised and trapped into what amounts to enslavement by a regime that imposes tyranny, cruelty and continuing terrible oppression. Nothing should diminish the reality that Eritrean victims of that persecution deserve all our solidarity, and they need to be supported by all of us who believe that conciliation and concession to regimes such as exist in Eritrea will surely fail. No such softening should ever be contemplated. Our own freedom compels us to fulfil our duty to those who are not free, and never will be until the vileness that imprisons Eritrea is ended once and for all.
That was really a remarkable intervention, difficult to forget. And I think your task, Mr. Stausboll, for the European Commission, it's not an easy task, because you are addressing, you will speak about the root causes of migration and displacement. We know these roots of migration. Many interventions have told us about it. It's slavery, oppression. It's a life which is not livable. So the question I would like to pose you is to the Commission and to the Council, because the policies are similar. Why, if we know the root causes, why is Eritrea considered a partner? Why this idea to stem the exodus, to stop the flight? So, to oblige the people to remain in these countries when they want. Nobody wants to flee. When they are obliged to flee their country. I think it's not easy, the answer of the Commission, and therefore I am grateful to you for testimony, the effort that perhaps the Commission can make in the future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It's always nice to be among friends, and it is indeed very good that we have this discussion today. When I speak, I do not just speak on behalf of the European Commission, I speak on behalf of the EU, and of course this includes also EEAS, that is clear. I was asked to briefly outline our approach to addressing instability and root causes, but also briefly to talk about Eritrea and Sudan. I have obviously listened to the discussion, and I realize this meeting is essentially about Eritrea. So I will indeed come back to Eritrea later on. I will, however, first of all, like to emphasize that we are fully aware that there are no quick fixes to addressing the root causes of migration. In reality, we have trying to address the poverty alleviation, which fundamentally is addressing the root causes of migration in the last 50 years. In some countries, we have been more successful than others, and there are clearly no quick fixes. It's also correct that I think development people like me, but also our colleagues in member states, is under an unprecedented pressure from other parts of governments to look into how can we better use development assistance as a part of the response to the migration crisis we have. It's also clear that we are in no respect going to compromise on the global and fundamental values of the EU in whatever we are doing, be it through the Trust Fund or be it through our normal engagement. Some of you made it sound a little bit like Valette is the starting point of an engagement with a number of countries. Martin, our first speaker, outlined basically saying all countries in the Horn of Africa are dictatorships with whom we should not work. The reality is we have been working and we are working with these countries the last 50 years. And of course there is a lot of discussion right now about Eritrea, but there is not the same degree of discussion about the fact that we are engaging closely with all the other countries of the Horn of Africa, which Martin qualified as dictatorships. I am not doing it. Nobody has asked us to have the same type of considerations that we are now having for Eritrea, for some of the other countries. First of all, the regional context, I think it's very important to bear in mind that the Horn of Africa is a region in Africa where we have most displaced people and refugees. Some 6.5 million internally displaced people and some 2.4 million refugees. It is a region where we have a lot of conflict of instability, mostly interstate, such as Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, but there's also a significant risk of interstate conflict, including between Eritrea and Ethiopia. We have seen in recent years a positive economic growth, but it is clear that it has not been inclusive and there are unequal benefits. And we are also, and here I talk across the board, in the terms of governance, we see pervasive corruption, weak accountability, and low levels of transparency, and that covers, I would say, globally all the countries. What is the EU doing to address the root causes of instability and irregular migration? You already referred to the action document, the new action plan that the European Council have adopted on the 26th of October. I do think if you read that document, you will realize this is much more than just migration. It is also instability. If you look at the action document as such, it is much wider than just addressing stopping the refugees coming. It is also about stability. It is also about using our programs better to promote economic development, etc. We will have high-level political dialogues. Some of you have referred to the cartoon process, but it's also clear we are planning to have, with most of the countries in the Horn of Africa, specific political dialogues on migration. For instance, we expect in Valette that there will be the signature of a statement between Ethiopia and the EU on how we can work together to address displacement, migration, etc. And we have to bear in mind that those issues, while African countries may not be specifically concerned about the refugees coming to Europe, they are very concerned about the overall number of people who are migrating in Africa, south-south, inside the region. So it is a simplification to say that migration displacement is just a European issue. It is also an issue that is very important for the African governments. I think Marie-Christine already in her introduction mentioned the fact that we have significant ongoing programs. In the Horn of Africa, we have some 3.7 billion euro of programs under the 11th EDF, the implementation of which has just started. And it is clear when it comes to operational priorities, the national ongoing programs is and will remain our main response. In comparison, the new EU Trust Fund that will be established on Thursday in Valette, we expect will mobilize some 600 million for the Horn of Africa. This covers 9 countries, and it doesn't take a calculator to conclude that this is not a lot of money per country. A few words on the EU Trust Fund. The overall objective is to support all aspects of stability and contribute to better migration management, as well as addressing the root causes of destabilization, forced displacement and irregular migration. And we do indeed hope that the Trust Fund, together with all our other instruments, will contribute to improved stability and development, more inclusive political and economic environment, and more new opportunities. Why have we proposed the creation of a trust fund? Why are we mobilizing new amounts of money? It is because, first of all, the trust fund gives us the possibility of addressing issues that were not covered by the existing programs. It allows us to move very swiftly and have a flexible response. And finally, it does allow us to pool contribution from various EU budget lines, but also contributions from the EU member states and other donors, including Switzerland and Norway, have confirmed that they will contribute to the trust fund. What are the strategic lines that we are pursuing? First of all, it is to fund actions that establish economic programs that create employment opportunities, especially for young people and women in local communities and returnees once they have arrived back in their countries of origin. We will work on strengthening resilience of communities, and in particular the most vulnerable, as well as refugees and displaced persons, in terms of food security and wider economy, provision of basic services, etc., to the most exposed people. We will contribute, and this will be done inside the cartoon framework, to improved migration management in countries of origin and transit, but also in countries that host major refugee communities, in line with the global approach to migration and mobility that has been adopted. And finally, we would finance activities that are in direct support to improve governance and conflict prevention. The cartoon process have already been referred to. I just want to maybe add to what I think you already explained. The cartoon process is right now the only process where Ethiopia and Eritrea sits together around the same table and discuss issues of common interest. So I do think this new regional approach may actually bring some benefits that goes beyond the focus on specific projects and activities we will finance. I would also, and that relates a little bit to the need for protection of refugees, like to mention that we expect in the Trust Fund to give major priority to what is called regional development and protection program targeting displaced people and refugees, in particularly in the countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda and Sudan, which are the largest receiving countries of displaced persons, and this obviously includes Eritreans. What are the long-term aim of these programs? Of course, our long-term aim is to avoid people being in displacement, but we do appreciate that we will continue to have in the Horn of Africa major number of people sitting in protracted refugees and displacement situations. We would like to protect these people, children, women, etc., but we would also like to support the creation of employment and education and livelihood opportunities with a view to improve the possibility for them to return. On Eritrea, I will now turn to Eritrea and briefly Sudan. I do think the EU fundamentally agree with the analysis that has been reflected here today. I do not wish to enter into a discussion about whether all the findings in the Commission of Inquiry reports are up to date, etc. I don't think that is the purpose of the discussion here. But we are obviously recognizing that we are dealing with a regime that is having a policy that is far from acceptable in a number of areas. That being said, we do disagree a little bit with the conclusion of that analysis. And as both Mrs. Mogherini and my commissioner has stated in the European Parliament, the EU continue to believe that engagement is the best option with the regime of Eritrea at this stage, in particular if we can target actions that are in the direct benefit of the population of Eritrea. It is also important to bear in mind that we have never suspended engagement with Eritrea. Eritrea has for 13 months unilaterally suspended their engagement with us, but the EU has never suspended. What is being prepared now is a normal program, normal in inverted commas, under the 11th EDF with Eritrea, which would have an amount of 200 million euro. There has been a lot of different figures out there. The program that we are presenting to our member states in the EDF committee on the 17th of November is 200 million. It would target provision of renewable energy, electricity, insofar as possible targeting the population of Eritrea, and it would have a component targeting what we call governance, including on human rights, including on improving the administrative capacity. We are not naive, that is clear, and we do clearly envisage when it comes to the implementation to apply what we call more for more. What we will propose to our member states and what we will present to the Parliament in the context of the democratic scrutiny we have accepted to apply for the EDF is a programming document which would have to be translated in the coming years into concrete projects. And it is clear it is in that process that we will really assess, do we get enough for our money in terms of progress on the political front. Here we will apply the more for more principle. One thing I would like to contest, however, very strongly, and that I think Martin focused on, basically giving the indication any money given to the government of Eritrea disappears into a black box and goes to the military. This is not how the European Development Fund operates. We are not giving blank checks to any countries. We are funding projects on the basis of our procedures and with a very close scrutiny of our delegation in Asmara. There is no blank checks, and I think if anything, we have a feeling that Eritrea is probably the least corrupt country in the Horn of Africa when it comes to fiduciary risks, etc. We are prepared, and I think it was our colleague from Eritrea that focused on the need for a holistic approach. We do appreciate the need for a holistic approach. We have reason to believe that the government is prepared to move on the national service. We have received very clear indications that they will start applying the 18 months national service. Of course, the proof of the pudding is out there. We are remaining sceptical, but insofar as they take this step, manage to implement it, that would, in our opinion, have been a very important step forward. On Sudan, Sudan is has not ratified the second amendment to the Cotonou Agreement, and that means Sudan is not eligible for a normal program under the 11th EDF, but we have the possibility, and we are finalizing a 100 million program that would be implemented outside government channels that would target the basic needs of the population in South Sudan. So here we are expecting to come to our member states in January with a programming document that would make a proposal for allocating an amount of 100 million for Sudan. Again there, we are obviously not naive about the regime in Sudan. We just remain committed that programs that target the need of the population are always justified under the circumstances we are facing. I think I would stop here. I don't know whether I gave full satisfaction to your question. Or maybe the last thing I want to emphasize is we are fully committed in having a dialogue with the European Parliament on both Sudan and Eritrea. We did have a first meeting, you'll probably remember, Marie-Christine, when we met in June, I think it was, having an informal discussion. We are prepared if we could create a similar forum for having an exchange with the Parliament at this stage in order to see to what extent can we really accommodate your concerns. We, of course, appreciate that the democratic scrutiny may not give you fully what you as elected people would like, and that's why we are prepared to have that dialogue if we could create the appropriate forum for having that discussion. It's not always easy to have informal discussions between our institutions, but we definitely stand ready to do that in the coming weeks if you find there is a need for that. I will stop here. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I can give to the organizers later, but I have adapted it a little bit as a function of the interest of the auditorium here, I would say, so we'll have to work a little bit on that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Stausboll. You know, we could discuss for hours about engagement as the best option, as Mrs. Mogherini says. I think that this option of engagement, if we had had the option of engagement in South Africa, there would not have been change in South Africa. So I'm not so sure that this engagement is the best option. I remember that the EU embassy in Eritrea, the civil servants of Europe who work there are not allowed to go out of Asmara. I remember that no MEP has had visa to go to Eritrea and to see what happens there. So I have doubts, but as you mentioned, Mr. Martin Plaut, I would like very much to give him perhaps the possibility to have a short reaction. Thank you, Mr. Plaut.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful. I think there's a slight misunderstanding. Hans made the point that I was considering all the states of the Horn of Africa dictatorships and therefore should really be ineligible for aid or assistance or a bilateral relationship. I'm not arguing that. I said specifically, and I quote, the Eritrean situation is not just bad, it is uniquely bad. Uniquely. I argued that Eritrea, and only Eritrea, should not be part of a dialogue and was unsuitable and not a legitimate partner for any relationship between the European Union and Africa. I'm not extending that to the rest of the region, although I have no illusions about them. I would point out that your suggestion that the EU should continue to believe that engagement is the best way forward is the third occasion on which this is being attempted, and attempted unsuccessfully always in the past. And as one of the French diplomats said at the time of the last failure, he said engagement with Eritrea is, and I quote, useless. Now, I mean, you know, one has to learn from one's mistakes. And if one continues to make mistakes in the same way, repeatedly, then one really has to ask oneself what on earth one is doing. I think that you also make the point that you do give no blank cheques in the funds that you're giving, but there is absolutely no independent organisation in Eritrea. This is the point I'm making. Every time you commission any activity inside Eritrea, you are dealing with the regime. You are dealing with front organisations for the regime. You're putting money into the pocket of the regime. There is no alternative. Therefore, all your activities are bolstering the regime, supporting them, and they will use that funds to support their military activities in the Horn of Africa, undermining stability And you will be responsible if for every pound, every euro that goes there is effectively bolstering the security of the regime and undermining the security of the Horn of Africa. And one has to face that and learn from one's lessons that and the mistakes one's made in the past. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Now we pass to the second part, the second panel, and I would like first my colleague Lydia Senra Rodriguez to come to the presidency and to come here the participants, the speakers of the second part of the conference. You know who is in the list, or do you want I give the names? Kubrom Dafla Hosabai, Desal Abraham, Luvam Estefanos, Wolde Jesus Anmar, if they can come here in the... It's okay.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vais essayer de m'exprimer en français, mais je dois dire que mon français ne marche pas très bien. Alors, on va essayer. Avant tout, merci Marie-Christine pour organiser cet événement. Merci pour m'inviter à participer parce que pour moi va être très utile pour mon travail avec ACP. C'est pour moi alors très important de pouvoir être ici. Et comme nous n'avons pas le temps, nous devons finir à 13 heures, non? Il faut que nous respectons le temps d'intervention, va être 5 minutes pour chacun. Et nous allons commencer avec les vidéo-contributions de Zacharias Guerin, je m'excuse pour la prononciation du nom, journaliste érythréen. C'est directement la vidéo.
Hello, my name is Zacharias Guerin and I'm a journalist. I've worked with the Eritrean State Television for 11 years before I came here to Uganda last year. Today I'll share my thoughts on the causes of the exodus from Eritrea and possible solutions to the problem. Without a single sound of a bullet in your country, an almost equal number of refugees from Syria arrive in Europe from Eritrea. Although Syria, a country with about 5 times the Eritrean population, is a country in total war, there would still be 5 times more refugees from Syria if the Eritrean government were asked to wreak its silent havoc there. Out of every 10,000 Africans, only every 5 people are Eritreans. Yet, out of only 10 Africans crossing the Mediterranean to Europe, every 4 people are Eritrean. Eritrea contributes almost 1,000 times its proportion to the flow of refugees from Africa, and the number indicates that there are 5 times more reasons for an Eritrean to leave their country than a Syrian. Within the last 15 years in Eritrea, in the absence of the sound of bullets and bombs, a silent war waged against its people by its own government has been threatening to destroy the country. People are routinely threatened, robbed, detained and killed by the state terror apparatus. Many people who were born when national service became indefinite with the start of the war in 1998 are now being taken for indefinite military and national service. Since 2001, the government have started paving the way for complete unquestioned dictatorship. The ruling party understood early that economic power is the key to its survival. As it weakened businesses and the national economy, its economic and financial monopoly increased to make it the single biggest economic power in the country. Any other pretension to private business and financial activity is dependent on the ruling party's direct or indirect control. After the war with Ethiopia, the most productive part of the society was held hostage by indefinite military service and the economy started to weaken fast. Using the unresolved border conflict with Ethiopia as the background for any decisions it took, the government introduced a regime of total oppression. The official 18 months of national service turned to years and then to more than a decade. Any Eritrean born between late 1960s and the late 1990s has to leave the country if they want any kind of chance at a normal life. The border war with Ethiopia and the subsequent total political oppression by the government, the crackdown on dissidents, muzzling of the free press, the proclamation of reconstruction through a national service scheme, a scheme which to all intents and purposes commenced the total siege of the Eritrean population, the total embargo by the government on imports and exports, its constant witch hunt of the private sector, and a mismanaged dwindling economy meant that Eritrea became unlivable for most of its citizens. With 364 prisons and detention centers around the country, all holding hundreds to thousands of people, every single day of the year has its own 1,000 people detained on a whim by a lawless regime. And for every 1 person detained, at least 4 people will do everything to escape their own homeland at the cost of more detention or death. By 2005, the economy had weakened beyond repair. The society had become completely traumatized and unable to move forward. Growth in most economic areas either stagnated or started to collapse. The society was held hostage to the exigencies of allowing the regime total hegemony. The government was unrelenting in its execution of its planned total control of the country. The population was constantly reminded of real and perceived enemies, and the need to tighten belts and close ranks was preached through the state-controlled media. As the ruling group divided and attacked all portions of the society, the nation was unable to rise against state colonization, and people's only choice was to leave the country by any means. All the traditional economies, which more than 70% of the population heavily relied upon, and any industry and service-based sections of the economy were deliberately weakened to allow the ruling party's economic wing full control of the country's economy. To help it weaken potential opposition, the government created conditions within the country that would push any actively functioning adult to leave the country. This meant that the most influential part of the society, like professionals, students, businessmen, and clergy, were the first targets. As the section of the society that had any hope of helping the society move forward and change its conditions was forced to emigrate, the remaining part could only follow. The government's denial of the global reality it lives in was even hailed by some as a revolutionary approach to development. Governments agreed and disagreed with the regime based only on regional or international interests. A false dichotomy between stability and democracy means that an appearance of stability in countries like Eritrea is silently sanctioned, and when a silent crisis erupts, it is usually too late, as examples abound today all over the Middle East and North Africa. Emboldened by the silence of the international community, the government continued tightening its grip on its society and worsening the conditions inside the country exponentially. At present, the ruling elite is long departed from reason that it is now impossible to change the way it operates. Inside Eritrea, a society that feels ignored by the whole world is resigned to the fact that any outside intervention to help change its conditions will never happen. The present refugee crisis has called for an international solution to the problem. In trying to solve the crisis and trying to engage the Eritrean government, the EU has to be careful not to reward tyranny or embolden it by appearing to accept how the regime runs the country. Many Eritreans would consider any aid to the Eritrean government unacceptable if it is not strongly attached to a categorical demand for reform. Free aid, as the promised EU aid package currently stands, is tantamount to sanctioning what the regime is doing to its own people. Of course, nobody can suspect that the EU is blind to the political factors that are driving the Eritrean exodus. But there might be hopes within the EU that funneling aid package to the country might help ease the refugee crisis. Serious engagement with the government might be helpful in solving the problem in the long run. The EU will have to approve the aid package aiming for long-term cooperation and not for instant results that can help with the present problem. In the end, regardless how many agreements are reached, change will not happen for the society if conditions are not returned to the pre-war status quo. To many observers, the reasons that push 1,000 people to risk their lives to cross the border every week, only to risk it once more at the hands of ransom-demanding gangs, only to barely survive the Sahara, and to yet once more risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean might be easier to classify as economic reasons. But such a hasty conclusion cannot be the basis for a solution to the refugee crisis. Returning conditions to that of early 1998 would mean an official reduction of the national service to its 18 months original duration, the release of incarcerated political dissidents and journalists, a clear timetable for constitutional transition, a reform on a remuneration system for civil servants, the establishment of an independent judiciary, the freedom for businesses to operate within their rights, a national budget, and financial audit system could be some of the basic prerequisites the EU could demand of the government in Eritrea. Another ignored factor that has helped the government to keep its society hostage is the unfinished border war with Ethiopia. It was declared in 1998 that the president held emergency powers due to the war declared by Ethiopia on Eritrea. Although a supposedly unfinished war is no reason to declare war on its own citizens, the situation offered the regime a carte blanche to rule the country on emergency basis. Any dissenters were presented as enemy agents, and the government labels opposition as traitors. The 1998 emergency powers are the root of the present regime, and so, even though the regime will always have saved up an enemy in the form of any or all of the neighboring countries, any progress towards finalizing the border issue would mean an end to the regime, as the group would lose its rationale to rule the way it does. If the border issue does not show signs of final resolution, and if necessary reforms are not introduced, Eritreans will continue to leave the country in ever-increasing numbers. And as time goes by and people lose their personal and social ties with the country, as they become more and more integrated with their host societies, changing the culture of immigration and enabling those refugees to return back to their homeland will become increasingly difficult. Also, as people are more and more disillusioned by their situation in host societies and their past traumas compound the problems, the resulting social issues might not be easy to deal with. The aid package, agreed with the regime that is at war with its own people, will only exacerbate the exodus. In a system where there is no government budget, the European Union will not find a transparent and accountable way to see through the government's internal transactions. Most of the money will be spent on buying services and materials from companies directly or indirectly owned by the party, strengthening it once more. For the short run, the easiest and most practical solution would be to provide coordinated help to refugees to make them highly productive members of their host societies, where Eritreans have already become powerful business communities. Helping the most active and promising leaders of the refugee population in East Africa region would create indirect means for the remaining part of the refugee population. In the longer run, this would help to improve the whole regional economy. 240 million euros would go a long way into changing the lives of tens of thousands of poor refugee families and helping them to settle in the region. Assistance to refugees in the region would be a welcome step and would go a long way to settle refugees and give them hope for the future.
Alors, on va continuer pour faire l'introduction à ce deuxième panel sur l'aide européenne au développement du Corne d'Afrique. Nous avons entre nous Kubron Dafla Hossabay, c'est membre de la communauté érythréenne dans l'Hollande. Nous avons aussi Adesala V. Abraham, auteur érythréen, Louvan Stéphanos de la campagne Stop l'esclavage et Gold Jesus Ammar du Parti démocratique du peuple érythréen. Je vous demande 5 minutes à chacun et après, pour pouvoir donner après la parole à la salle. Alors, quand vous voulez, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Well, I was in Düsseldorf the day before yesterday to present a similar thing on this EU funding, and I had a lengthy PowerPoint, so I asked our colleagues here to do it, but I think it's too long, so I'll just go on with my presentation from the PowerPoint, but I can't follow it there. So please, you can interrupt it. Yeah. So the title that I would like to give to this money that's being given to the Eritrean regime is, mildly speaking, throwing good money after bad. And what is the issue? EU plans to fund the Eritrean regime with 200 million euros. Why at all is that wise? EU knows maybe tenfold what we have, that this regime is not a functional regime in any analysis, political, business, economic, it's not there. So why would EU help a regime, a dictator, declared dictator? Well, I will leave that to the EU, but to Eritreans who are fighting to bring a change, if EU helps the regime, then it stands against the Eritrean people, in every sense of that word. So what we ask the EU is, don't help. If you want, don't help us. Don't help the people in the change, but don't help the regime. If you help the regime with 200 million for whatever reason, then you stand against the plan for change in Eritrea. We will do it without EU if necessary. It takes time. We are a very weak people when it comes to organization. All Eritreans in this delegation came late, including myself, so we are not good at organizing ourselves, but we'll do it. Why do I qualify as a witness here? Because I have been in the center of power and the politics and the economy of the regime since 1975. I have been Vice Minister for Finance. I have been head of the National Treasury, head of the Tax Office. I was the manager of Eritrean Airlines. I was the official representative of Eritrea as a governor to the IMF, the World Bank, and the Bretton Woods organizations. I was head of the department that deals with public debt and investment, so I challenge the EU, my EU colleague who was presenting it, about helping Eritrea. It's not right what he said. Helping Eritrea would never come through the regime. Martin Plaut put it good. There is no other organization in Eritrea other than the regime itself. So why would EU, what is the logic? Okay, let's stand from the point of view of the EU. I think they are trying to bring some solution that will stop immigration in Europe. When compared to the Eritreans that come to Europe, the Eritreans that are around, we are about 1 million now in Ethiopia and Sudan. the ones that are coming in Eritrea, in Europe, are tens of thousands. Not a small number, but still the problem of refugees is not Europe. So if we want to help Eritreans, we have to go to the roots. And the roots are, we differ on the diagnosis of what the root cause is. Eritrea is sick, chronically sick. EU knows that, we know it. But EU says it's diabetes, and they would like to give some insulin and maybe a planned diet. We think it's gangrene. Cut off the regime from this problem first. That's the only problem, before it spreads to the body. It's now in the limb. The gangrene is in the limb, and we plan to cut it out. The problem in Eritrea, the root cause, I just quote some of the words that the name was Hans, I think, that brought, it was the aid would come to capacity building, solar energy, and these things. What are these things? The plan of the Isaias regime is a systematic way of suffocating the whole country, and it has been going on for years, 20 years, 25 years. When people were enjoying the new freedom, Isaias was working with this plan, and he consummated it in 2001. Actually, in 1998, when he declared the war on Eritrea, on Ethiopia. So we are trying as Eritreans to try to go out of it, but the main source is not something about capacity. It is a systematic way of suffocating the people. How is it done? Because I was in the economic sector, it is first of all destitution as a plan, hunger strategy. That is, in Eritrea there is no activity whatsoever. It's illegal in Eritrea to run any activity. It is illegal. I mean, you can't import, you can't engage yourself in the workforce. So how could an economy function when the workforce is legally in the military service, legally in the militia, legally in the ex-freedom fighter duty? The whole population has been classified, put in 3 boxes. One is the military service, which includes all people under the age of, anybody can tell me? It's not 40, it is 60. Why 60? The law says 40, but the proclamation came out in 1994. So anybody who was 40 in 1994 is still under that obligation. So that Damocles sword is on anybody under 60. That is a national service duty. So he can put you out of your activity anytime. You can't work, you can't marry, you can't travel. And the second one is the militia that they declared now 3 years ago. The militia duty, which takes anybody who is above 60. And then the ex-EPLF fighters like myself who are under military duty. So anytime Isaias wants, he can accuse anybody and he can put him in prison. And that prison has no due process of law, no habeas corpus, no nothing. So everybody is out of the workforce. By definition, Eritrea can't work. You can't seek a job in any work. You can't start a commercial activity. You can't travel. You can't go abroad to learn. So what is your future? For all of these people, the escape route is exile. I don't call it immigration, emigration, or whatever. It's exile. Leaving your family is exile. Somebody stops me here because this is it. We can't even describe enough, because this is a serious problem, and we would like to tell ourselves. So in the Valette, if you give money to Isaias, you are standing against EU, just like Chamberlain tried to appease Hitler. That's it. I didn't present, but...
Merci. Je donne la parole à Dessa Lavrin quand vous voulez.
Thank you. In fact, I'm not sure if I'm left with anything more to tell you. I live in Norway, and a priest invited me to his home with his wife, and I told him every pain I went through in Eritrea. And the next day, his wife called me, and she said, "We didn't sleep the whole night." I showed them a horror video without warning. It is very painful. It's, maybe I can speak general about the conditions, and if I can define a little bit. But in Eritrea, generally we say Menshum Ali Haboy Itmodayu. I can help with the translation. Is to say it's better to be a monk in your own home than to be a king in others' land. So this shows under which condition the Eritreans are living their country. There must be something really went wrong, seriously went wrong, if an Eritrean is living home. Because for an Eritrean, home doesn't mean just home. It is more than that, including for myself and every Eritrean here. Actually, Europe was not my dream, and I believe it was not the dream of anyone, but you know it, and you have heard it. How many people are coming to Europe? How many people are lost in their life in the way? And sometimes we think they are economy immigrants, but you can simply see how much they are affording to come here. At least if someone is, let's say if someone is paying $10,000 to leave Eritrea and to cross the Sahara and the Mediterranean, $10,000 is a big money in Eritrea. Even $5,000 is a big money in Eritrea. You can invest with $5,000 in Eritrea if the situation was favorable to do so. Yes, we have poverty, but we can fight our poverty. The problem is the system. We didn't allow us to fight our poverty. I was a writer. I can live by writing in Eritrea. I was a cultural researcher. I could do my my researches, and I can live. A farmer can live on his lands, but we are not allowed to do so. And the problem is the system that you want to help. So, if you are helping the one who is kicking me off my country, which I once belonged, to solve your own pain, and they are worsening my pain, this is a little bit painful for me, and they have said it more than I did actually. Actually, if situation in Eritrea is better than it is, people could not only leave Eritrea, but the people who are here can go back home. We remember in 1991, all of my Eritrean fellows here know the song which was Latai Tal'al Nakhid Adna. Get on Latai and let's go back home. Even they didn't thank the hosting countries. Even they didn't say goodbye to hosting. They were rushing back home because we thought that it was independence, but it was not. So, I don't know. This is a very secretive system or regime, and it doesn't make any budget planning public. So if the EU says it is a budget problem, I don't know how they knew it. How they knew it at all, because the system never ever told anything about their budget, physical, annual, or whatever. Even IMF doesn't know about it. So how did they know that the system has a budget problem? So what I would like to say, maybe this is the last thing I may say, but as my friend or my father, I can say, said it, we have too many refugees in Sudan, in eastern Sudan and northern Ethiopia. So if there is any organization or EU or let's name it, want to help, they can help those refugees. They can help them with their education. And we know where Eritrea is heading. Now we are talking about this present Eritrea. This is quite, it is comparing with the Eritrea which has to come. This Eritrea is a well-to-do Eritrea, and it's a secure Eritrea under the dictator. But there will come an Eritrea soon, which is under anarchy and civil war, possibly. Then there will come people with good reason to be refugees. So let us work for the refugees who are already in an accessible place. I'm almost done. So to conclude my thing is, if there is money to be meant to really help the people, let them go to the refugees which are already in eastern Sudan. Generations has gone since 60s and 70s, and the newcomers to the Ethiopian northern refugee campus, and they will be an asset for Eritrea, for the future of Eritrea, of course. Thank you so much.
Merci. C'est difficile de demander d'arrêter la parole, mais le temps, c'est implacable. Alors, nous demandons la parole à Louvan Stefanos. 5 minutes. Merci.
Thank you. My name is Louvan Stefanos. I am a student and human rights activist. The main message of my short speech is to highlight, through and against backdrop of my personal experience, how the indefinite national service, which ultimately became national slavery in Eritrea, is the root cause of the current Eritrean refugee crisis. The Eritrean youth are forcibly conscripted to an indefinite military service, where their labor is exploited and survive with roughly $10 a month. The level of vulnerability of women conscripted to sexual harassment and other forms of sexual abuse by higher ranks in the military is particularly high. I say this as a former conscript. Conscripts are prohibited from exercising their faith. Praying and possessing holy books can lead to severe punishments. Underage conscription to the open-ended military service is a standard practice. Random round-ups and arbitrary arrests of draft evaders and civilians is a routine occurrence. The prospects of the Eritrean youth become practically dead once they are involuntarily and conscripted to the national service. Eritrea is one of the worst countries to be young and human. One cannot aspire or even dream of freedom, education, family, career, or even life. And due to the ruthless treatment of the regime and the indefinite national service, many Eritreans, youngsters like me, some even as young as 12, are escaping Eritrea to anywhere their foot takes them. There is almost no household in Eritrea that's not affected by the tragedy of the Eritreans who constantly lose their lives in the Sinai Desert and the Mediterranean. Again, all this misery because of the indefinite national slavery. As a result of the hopelessness of the situation, the youth are fleeing the country en masse. This has been highlighted by the UN Commission of Inquiry in its recent investigative report. Moreover, freedom of press is non-existent. Scores of journalists and political dissenters have been languishing in prisons across Eritrea. without access to fair trials and due process. Many leaders and ordinary members of the minority religious groups have been facing countrywide crackdown and indefinite imprisonment. In particular, members of the Pentecostals and the Jehovah's Witnesses are detained in high-security prisons across the country under the inhuman conditions merely for practicing and refusing to deny their faith. In light of the above, it behoves the EU to consider long-term solutions to the human rights situations in Eritrea. Simply giving out millions of euros in development aid to the Eritrean regime will only serve to prop up the brutal dictatorship in Eritrea. The EU must realize that the ongoing gross and systematic human rights abuse in Eritrea cannot be solved financially. I welcome support for Eritreans and Eritrean development. I particularly welcome any aid package that would benefit the tens of thousands of young people who have been over the years missed out on the opportunities to gain education, training, and job prospects. I also welcome measures that would enable many Eritreans to not become victims of human trafficking and dangerous smuggling. But that assistance should never be at the cost of empowering the regime and legitimizing the abusive system that enslaved me and my peers for 2 decades. Thank you.
Merci. Alors, Bold Jesus Amar, vous avez la parole.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, it's as you can see, it will be very difficult to say much on Eritrea in 5 minutes. Even if I am the last speaker, I would have said more. But simply because I have been one of those, like my colleagues here, who started all this, liberation struggle. And not only that, who was a classmate with my friend over here of the dictator of today, and who, was a cause of going to the liberation movement at that time. Anyway, on 9 November, we are 9 November today, and in 2009, we were also here, thanks to the indomitable friend Miriam Van Ryzen. And what I said at that meeting, it was for EU-US relations towards the Horn of Africa and Eritrea. And that conference in Brussels made so many important recommendations. And as it has become usual for the European Union, it ignored all suggestions, all appeals by Eritreans and their friends. This is a fact. And I think it's a futile exercise that we are calling on to again today, because I don't think it will be heard. Why do we say this? We are not saying that support should not come to people. We are not saying that we don't need support. But if you try, chemically, if you try something and it gets wrong, you don't repeat again and again, because it will give you the same result. What the European Union is doing is that it will just do nothing with the money it's giving. Well, what we said, what the conference also recommended in 2009, November 9, incidentally I said, was that, and I was one of the speakers, and I presented that request to the European Union. And that was, give support to Eritreans, they need it, but give it to the right forces. Don't stop things from Eritreans, but give it. How? Many countries stopped technical assistance to Eritrea in the last 10 years, if not more. But it should not be, blocked from reaching Eritreans. Somehow it should have gone there. We have, as my compatriot Dafla said, 1 million Eritreans in the Horn of Africa. in the Sudan and Ethiopia. They have been there since 1967. Many of them starting that time. What we suggested and what I have been writing to the European Union as a member of this opposition struggle was we have refugees in eastern Sudan and in northern Ethiopia. Well, the technical assistance money stopped by Switzerland, by Germany, etc., should not be stopped reaching Eritreans. It should at least do something to these people. Why are all these 4 million Syrians trying to come? The refugees, I mean, in Jordan and in Lebanon. Because even the minimum living situation is not acceptable. They prefer to die than having that kind of life. Well, improving the life situation of refugees in the Horn of Africa, in the camps. The camps, if you see the camps, and EU delegations have seen them, are not even camps, they are not worth living. Improve the camps, give some facility for people to live, one. And then there is a lot of money. For instance, we have 200 million European money now. And all the money which was suspended from reaching Eritrea could be asked, as we asked in 2006 years back. We asked, please do something. We have so many Eritrean non-state actors who can help you. Just ask the northern Ethiopian authorities and the Sudanese and do some, arm twisting and let them cooperate and help these people to have some living situation at that time, to have some education. Even scholarships from this suspended money, not suspended from Eritreans, but at least to challenge the regime, because if it is not helping, as Martin Plaut was telling us, it just insulted the European Union. It just told them, you can do nothing for us. So what we propose is that we go back to the Brussels conference of 2009 and read what it said. And European Union, please come back to your senses. Don't appease. Stop doing anything. Stop giving legitimacy to a regime which does not deserve it, which is uniquely, bad in Africa. And if it does not listen, if the European Union does not listen to this, well, the worst will anyway come. Eritrea is the most militarized society in Africa, and there will be more affecting the national interest of Europeans when the worst comes also. Thank you.
Merci. Nous avons 5 minutes pour un petit débat de salle et je ne sais pas qui veut demander la parole.
I use the microphone.
Je vais être très bref. Lorsqu'on examine un peu le rapport de la Commission européenne avec le régime érythréen, je ne dirais pas, c'est une attitude de lâcheté, je ne serais pas incommode, mais on dirait une sorte de pusillanimité. En fait, on dirait qu'il y a une sorte de fascination de la Commission vis-à-vis du régime érythréen. Bon, l'aspect moral, je n'ai pas à commenter là-dessus, mais politiquement, il y a une faute. Je ne vais pas répéter ce que la plupart des intervenants ont déjà dit. Moi, j'ai la chance de vivre en Belgique, j'ai la chance d'être un citoyen belge, citoyen européen, et je ne vois aucune transparence, évidemment, de contribution que je paye en tant que citoyen que ça soit payé en partie pour consolider un régime dictatorial de la plus pire espèce qui puisse exister actuellement. Donc, ça ne m'étonne pas pourquoi les institutions européennes sont un peu désaffectées. Il y a une défiance des citoyens européens. Et ça, c'est un des exemples. Il y a beaucoup de citoyens européens ici. Si on prenait évidemment leur point de vue, ils seraient opposés, évidemment. Je pense qu'il va falloir réfléchir à deux fois avant de se plonger dans un acte qui peut être considéré comme une sorte de complicité. Merci.
Well, Mr. Plot was speaking. One quote kept coming to my mind and has continued to resonate, and that is, insanity is simply defined as doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. And I guess my question would be, if we know that sanctions aren't working, if we know that giving funds for economic aid aren't working because they're not going to the right people, as an American, I know all too well what neoconservatism and what trying to invade a country can do. However, at what point do we take some sort of militaristic action towards this regime, or at what point do we take different, more radical steps in eradicating such a heinous government in Eritrea? Anybody want to answer?
Yeah, I'll say it in English. I have a question related to, in parallel to what the EU is having in terms of talks. We have heard, and I don't know if Martin Plaut is still in the room, but many missions of national governments going to Eritrea to check the situation there, and that's migration officers, basically to see whether it's safe to return people. And I wanted to know if some of you have more information, because this has had an impact, from what I could read, on the recognition rate of Eritrean asylum seekers. So I would be really grateful for more information about that.
Oui, des paroles encore et après
okay, ouais,
vous aurez 1 minute chacun pour répondre. Oui, toi et après là-bas. Oui, toi.
Ce serait pour dire que il y a 10 fois plus d'immigrants érythréens dans les pays voisins comme le Soudan et l'Éthiopie. Et quelles sont les actions qu'on fait par rapport à ça? Pourquoi on ne pourrait pas aider ces pays justement parce que la frontière est juste à côté et c'est une ligne. Donc, c'est eux les plus affectés, c'est eux qui ont le plus d'influence, qui pourraient le plus aider justement à améliorer la situation des immigrants. Quels sont les... Est-ce que c'est envisagé ou d'aider les pays voisins, ou est-ce qu'on veut rester fixé sur se concentrer sur l'Érythrée même plutôt que de considérer ça comme un problème de toute la région?
Yes, thank you for all this.
Un moment. Avant, c'est monsieur là-bas.
Sorry, a question was Martin Plaut. A question was asked me about what the impact of these missions has been. To be honest with you, they've been very detrimental. The Norwegians went, the British went. There were a lot of them, but frankly, some of the documents are highly contested. And they quoted from Eritrean experts and misquoted them, and the Eritreans themselves have actually, Professor Chaim Gebriab has actually rejected every interpretation that's been made of the use of the documents that he helped with. But the British have now changed their policy towards asylum seekers, And if anybody wants it, there's a new Amnesty International briefing which came out last week, which is very critical of what has happened, and the results are there for everybody to see. Let me just read you one sentence, if I may. The Home Office continues to rely upon these discredited documents, and since their introduction, they have resulted in asylum claims, including those made by unaccompanied minors, being refused on the basis that illegal exit and draft evasion are no longer give rise to a risk. Asylum statistics show that in the quarter following the change in the Home Office guidance, the refusal rate for Eritrean claimants increased dramatically from 14% to 66%.
Il faut couper l'intervention parce que nous n'avons pas le temps. Je m'excuse.
What did they say?
No.
I'm happy to give you the document now.
Okay.
Thank you very
Oui.
much. Sorry.
Oui, c'est vous, oui.
Je suis vraiment navrée que M. Dafla, qui est le maximum expert sur l'économie et la situation érythréenne, n'a pas pu, même pas seulement maintenant, même avant, il aurait pu être là-bas et expliquer vraiment. Peut-être il aurait changé quelque chose. Et pour ça, j'espère que la prochaine fois, vous tiendrez compte de sa épaisseur, surtout sur l'économie du pays. Deuxièmement, c'est après que le procès Khartoum a commencé, la situation d'Érythrée a empiré. Il semble vraiment un jeu qu'on est en train de faire. L'Europe est en train de jouer avec le désespoir du peuple parce que après le procès Khartoum a commencé à démolir les maisons. Et le pire est en train d'enfuir et à augmenter le peuple désespéré qui sort d'Érythrée. Donc, comment est-ce qu'on peut, avec cet accord et en donnant de l'argent, qu'on peut arrêter? Et c'est vraiment... l'Europe, j'espère qu'elle ne va pas faire un crime, parce que si à dénoncer, c'est aussi donner à ces criminels qui vendent les Érythréens. Il y a un document des Nations Unies qui, un de ces généraux, vend les Érythréens au Sinaï. Et donc... à discuter avec ça, ça veut dire donner de l'honneur à un criminel et je suis navrée vraiment.
Merci. Merci. Encore, je donne la parole à les intervenants, 1 minute pour chacun pour répondre. Je suis limitée.
Okay. Well, I would just like to say only that on the question of the Danish and especially the Denmark, the delegation has been discredited officially in Denmark. So that report that they had in Eritrea, that it's peaceful, has been rejected, and the immigration officials who was in that delegation has been officially, well, not officially in the press, but they have been sidetracked or they have been put aside because that report was false. That's what I know. And anything else that goes to the government is useless. Just like Martin said, there is no national budget, no planning, economic planning, no auditor general, no nothing. So whom are you going to give the money to? That's my question.
Just respond. If you need to close, your last chance.
To reply for the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I should answer your question. Yeah, I have nothing more to say. I wouldn't suggest a military intervention from the U.S., the last thing I would want. But I would, for starters, you can stop, the US or and the EU can stop aiding the Eritrean regime, no money whatsoever, and pressure the regime more. It works in some ways. It worked when the Eritrean regime imprisoned 3 UK prisoners, imprisoned 3 UK citizens 5 years ago now, and they threatened to close their embassy in Eritrea, and the ambassador and threatened to kick him out of the country if the Eritrean regime don't release the hostages. And within 1 day, they released them. And block the 2%, the illegal taxes the Eritrean regime collects in diaspora, and many more you can do. Thank you.
Yes, un minute chacun, s'il vous plaît.
Just the word, on top of what Luam said, we have been asking and still ask, supporters to, help capacity building of those forces which are not working for the regime, which are non-state actors everywhere, Eritrean communities. If these are empowered, if some of this money goes to a television broadcast and radio broadcast, more reinforced broadcasting to Eritrea. That is the fight, But military intervention, Europe will not do it for Eritrea. It's not quit.
A question came to my mind. Actually, one of my friends always used to say that's good. Africa has just one horn. If it have had 2, then it will have more mess. But I would love to ask you, especially for our European friends, God forbid, but if we have had the same government that we have in Eritrea, what would you have done with it? A government which you never voted for, a government which has no constitution, a government which knows no transparency, no accountability. Would you take it as your representative? Thank you.
Merci. À ce moment, je donne la parole à Myriam Van Reysen qui va faire des conclusions avec Marie-Christine pour fermer ces tables. Merci.
I'll just be very, very brief. It has been a fascinating morning, and actually I have learned a great deal. And Kubrum, I think that your presentation was maybe too short, but it was extremely relevant. And I just quote from your presentation. You said, how can we support a regime that is systematically suffocating the country, and where the whole economy is run by a military setup. And I think that really is fundamentally the problem, that if the root cause of the migration was unemployment or was economical, then this could make some sense. But at the root cause is that there is no economy, because the economy is completely captured and captivated by the military space that runs the regime. And that, I think, is essentially what we need to understand. And I'm glad, Mark, that you took that quote from Martin Plaut. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And this is really the frustration that has come out here today, that we are repeating the same recipe, and in fact no one can tell us what a result has been of a policy of engagement. There is not even one result that we actually can identify. And I just want to close by saying that it has been a pleasure, a really great pleasure, and I want to thank Marie-Christine, Barbara, all the colleagues from the European Parliament, that we have this democratic space in Europe. We must really treasure it. Some of us are actually under great pressure by the long arm of the regime, which is also intruding on our democratic space here in Eritrea, here in the European Union. Here in Europe. Yeah. And I want to say that for that, a constitution matters. Eritrea has never implemented its constitution. In Europe, we have the Lisbon Treaty. The three essential elements for development cooperation and cooperation with third countries are respect for human rights, good governance, the rule of law. None of these three are remotely in place in Eritrea, and I should really, really ask our colleagues in the European Parliament to test this plan to provide 240 million to Eritrea, because it's undermining our own European constitution. And again, Marie-Christine, I thank you for hosting this fantastic event, and I think we have learned a great deal, and I'm very, very appreciative for the collaboration with your office and for the courage of you to host this event today. Thank you.
Bon, je vais essayer d'être rapide moi aussi. Je voudrais d'abord faire passer un message. On est ici au Parlement européen. Et donc, on est dans une des institutions de l'Union européenne. Dans ces institutions, ça peut être un espace effectivement de démocratie et de droits de l'homme, où nous essayons de donner la parole, notamment dans mon groupe parlementaire, aux acteurs de la société civile, quels qu'ils soient. Ça fait 1 an, moi, que je bataille contre le processus de Khartoum. Et petit à petit, je pense que dans l'enceinte du Parlement européen, il y a une certaine prise de conscience. Et cet événement aujourd'hui va nous aider, je pense, à continuer la prise de conscience. Parce que, comme je l'ai dit en introduction, effectivement, l'Érythrée est un des pires régimes du monde et le pire régime de l'Afrique. Néanmoins, je travaille sur l'ensemble des pays de la Corne de l'Afrique. Donc, déporter le problème, je crois que c'est aussi ce que cherche à faire l'Union européenne aujourd'hui. Jouer de la triangulation entre les différents pays de la Corne de l'Afrique. Et je pense que ce n'est une solution pour aucun des peuples de la région concernée. Aucun. Parce que c'est pas, je vais être un peu plus direct, c'est pas en jouant le Soudan, l'Éthiopie contre l'Érythrée ou inversement que nous arriverons à une solution pour cette région du monde. Et l'intervention militaire, non merci, ça va. Les Européens ont suffisamment donné, notamment au Moyen-Orient, avec les conséquences que l'on connaît. Je pense que ça ne peut pas non plus être la solution. Nous allons avoir un débat mercredi après-midi, puisque nous avons ce qu'on appelle une mini-plénière du Parlement européen à Bruxelles, où il sera question du fonds fiduciaire. Nous pourrons poser des questions et ce que nous avons entendu ce matin pourra peut-être nous aider. Nous avons un rôle au Parlement européen, c'est de contrôler les fonds européens. Et je pense que sur cette question-là, effectivement, nous devons travailler et nous devons travailler tous ensemble. Parce que peut-être une des raisons pour lesquelles il n'y a pas eu de réunion où qu'on répète les mêmes choses, c'est qu'on ne travaille pas assez dans la continuité. Et moi, je me félicite de cette réunion ce matin parce que ça peut nous permettre de travailler dans la continuité. Parce que le régime érythréen actuellement mène une campagne, y compris sur les réseaux sociaux, y compris contre en utilisant la diaspora. On n'en a pas parlé ce matin et je le regrette, de la façon dont le régime érythréen utilise, manipule ou réprime la diaspora érythréenne. Et il mène une campagne actuellement sur les réseaux sociaux qui est assez hallucinante. Et je pense que c'est aussi aux Érythréens de savoir y répondre, de la diaspora, parce que c'est une façon d'aider la population qui vit dans les conditions que l'on sait en Érythrée. Donc moi, je vous remercie tous et toutes d'avoir été présents ce matin. J'espère que nous aurons d'autres occasions de travailler ensemble. Et j'espère que le rendez-vous ne sera pas dans 5 ans et que nous aurons l'occasion de revenir, de continuer à travailler parce qu'effectivement, compte tenu du contexte actuel, il y a urgence pour empêcher les aides de l'Union européenne d'arriver en la matière. Donc un grand merci, un merci tout particulier à nos interprètes qui nous ont donné un quart d'heure de rab, si je puis dire. Merci à vous tous et toutes et à très bientôt, j'espère.